Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my meetings. Not that regular as I wish to, but here we go. So today I'd like to talk about what I wanted to talk about at the beginning of the series. Talk about the cognitive biases, and specifically today's theme is confirmation bias. So why do we want to talk about biases or latent series? Well, initially, I thought I'll go through the logic and critical thinking tenets, and then we'll go into biases, but then we got sidetracked. Again, great to hear from what you think. I've heard recently that perhaps I should do more of these, and I should do less esoteric subjects, maybe. I think last week we had, or last month we had a sense-making subject, where I think they're all quite practical and not, probably not as much as the confirmation bias is very, very practical subject. So why are we talking about biases? Well, although in the beginning we talked about how to be reasonable, what it means to be reasonable, most people and most of situations, except some specific situations which are quite unique. Your workplace, unique. They're not rational. Some people would say that we are irredeemably irrational, that we do act unreasonable, and sometimes motives are inaccessible to us. Motives are very complicated, mishmash of the genetic, external influence, childhood traumas, and inner being, ego interaction with the being. It is really hard, right? So, we are irredeemably irrational. So on that strictly basis, then we're guided by emotional sensation, but that's not true entirely. Although we're highly emotional animals, we try to make sense of the world. And when we try to make sense of the world, we build some constructs, and these constructs sometimes are not great. I mean, otherwise we wouldn't need science of logic. We'll be logical, but we do. And it's important then for us to, even though our experiences are all subjective and we're quite far removed from what reality actually is, to be able to describe the narrative that is cognitively agreeable. And so because of this, I think it's important to study logic and science, but I do digress. So I think I'll start today with very common bias, and that's not something that people think that's common. But here is the example. There's literally hundreds and hundreds of what we call psychologically tested biases. There is a view that somehow they're wrong, and they are not wrong. They are just different ways of seeing reality, filters that you do see reality through. That's all. I mean, everything is filters, to speak, starting from your eyes. But there's some ways to process. Some of them are very evolutionarily useful, right? So you need some blinders, and being aware of them is very important. So they're all being tested psychologically in many conditions. Some of these are big ones we'll talk about, and I think we talked about them before, but I just like to devote the whole session to each one. We'll start with confirmation. We'll talk about framing and availability and overconfidence and things like base rate neglect and so on. So I think the confirmation bias specifically is all about using, accepting the evidence that you have a prior belief for, and not accepting something that is not according to your belief, so to speak. I mean, that probably is a best definition, but here it is, and the picture here shows everything. You probably go for the left rather than for the right when things are uncomfortable to you. It sort of goes against your innate belief. There's a quote from Leo Tolstoy on top, but it says that most men, very clever men, even those who are very clever and capable of understanding very difficult scientific mathematical problems, can very seldom discern even the simplest, most obvious truth if it be such as to oblige them to admit falsity of conclusions they have formed, perhaps with much difficulty. Conclusions which they are proud, they have taught to others, and which they have built their lives. How unpleasant? Very unpleasant. Can it be done? Difficult. And all of us are in the same, me included. Everybody's in the same sort of boat, yeah. Difficult. Can we go through this? And some people perhaps do a little bit better. Some people who are more naturally inclined to what I'd call scientific method, maybe more kind of rational, do it, but some others don't. A lot of them don't. So confirmation bias is the tendency to search, interpret, favor information that confirms prior beliefs or values. This is straight from Wikipedia. People display this bias when they see that information supports their view, and they do ignore the counter information when they interpret the ambiguous evidence. So when the ambiguous evidence, especially, you will sort of interpret according to their belief. And especially that is very strong for emotionally charged issues. The emotionally people, have basically a background of where they come from, and when it kind of cuts across their traditional values, the firmly held beliefs, so anything to do with belief, basically, then, if it's a mathematical problem that your reputation is not kind of held over, it's all about, how to make a new way of cooking that you haven't thought about. Of course you will accept the new recipe. Of course you will accept an advice on better playing chess. But as long as the reputation is not staked, if your reputation is staked on a different advice that you have perhaps given before, and this goes against you, personally, and it might mean that your reputation will be ruined, or your authority is undermined, you will resist. So biased search of information is critical here, right? So you will search for the information that is to your side. So I'm not gonna talk about specific conflicts, but say in wars or during the kind of agitated situation between nation states, let's not name names. Of course, you will only select the information that will show your side as a winner, as a right side too, and having a higher moral ground. The opposite side will do exactly the same. Any issue, yeah. I mean, I talked about hundreds of times. Just know that, right? So I mean, you probably talk about three things here. I mean, there's listed four, but I'll talk about the attitude polarization, belief perseverance, and illusory correlations. So what is, these are parts of the confirmation bias because you selected. So here is the picture of, kind of a Venn diagram of evidence we ignore. And there's a lot of facts and evidence now, but we also have beliefs. Sometimes our beliefs coincide, and that is the evidence we believe, right? So sometimes you'd say, well, X% of the time we have been attacked, right? And our party is the aggrieved party. So here's your evidence. Now, there might be an evidence that your side also committed some attacks, right? But that side would be ignored because that goes against your belief that your side here is A, right, B, moral, and occupies moral higher ground, and seen capable of kind of being a bad actor. So goes outside, it's impossible. So it could either be what do you call it? It could be um, fake. It could be made by the other side, or it might be, if proven, might be sort of a stray actor that doesn't actually stand for the same with you, stand for your beliefs. It's very common in many groups. For example, if some extreme members of group commit some atrocities, and then that group would say, well, they don't really truly belong to us. Well, that way you could say, you can cut them out. Now, the opposite side will do exactly the same. It will say, well, look, these, let's say, suicide bombers are here and they represent Islam. So therefore, they're the true representation. And then you kind of lumped with them. Now, the evidence that Islam might be peaceful in some other respects is completely ignored. I mean, it's a very common, I'm just using that example. It's so common in any of the emotionally charged issues. So let's talk about a very interesting subject, which is belief perseverance. And it's basically maintaining belief despite that there is some more new information that contradicts it. So you have been numerous examples when others attempted to present evidence and debunk a lot of beliefs, but they would have a backfire effect. So for example, you'd have, I mean, it's very common, the vaccination hesitancy, we've seen it so many times just in the recent crisis. In the study, a subject expressed their concern, for example, a side effect. I mean, I'm talking about pandemic, right? After being told the vaccination was safe, you would, become even less eager to accept them. Now, the more debunking evidence you put in front of the people that do not want to be converted to your side, the more stronger they will be their belief. In fact, their belief will be increased. Why this is? Because that goes to the core of their belief system. So I'm not sure whether this is if you are by nature a little bit distrustful of the government. The great example is the flat earth theory, right? So the more you think how ridiculous it is, the more people genuinely believe it. Generally, I don't think they're liars, all of them. And they will persist in your theory because that's sort of where that becomes their moral kind of ground. It becomes their sense of being, a core belief system. Well, you can't break core belief system with more argument, okay? So it's a second one, an interesting, called attitude polarization. So what this happens is it's also an effect of confirmation bias, but it will be the tendency of people to search and interpret evidence only selectively. And when people encounter evidence, this could potentially result in them interpreting that as support of their attitude. So because the same evidence is ambiguous, the two sides will draw completely different conclusions from it. So for example, you can see it in the recent war over Ukraine, right? So one side seeing, well, that atrocities have been committed, the other side think they're fake because you have actually observed some examples, and two debunkings agreed sort of continue. One is kind of investigation A, the other one is investigation B, and you'll say, well, they have uncovered it. Look at these people; they have uncovered all the evidence. They have sent the forensics, they've sent X, Y, and Z. But you'll say, wait a second. These are all from biased countries. They're European, American, French. None of them are Russian. So therefore, we will not recognize the result of this. It's very simple, and you will not recognize it because they could indeed be biased. Now you will polarize. Now the effect is observed with things like hot button issues, politically charged things. For most issues, you won't have the polarization, but the polarization effect happens where you kind of gradually, as you talk, you diverge, and then That's another interesting observation. The more political kind of confrontation happens, the more extreme it becomes, because people also retrench to the positions that are more extreme. They will be pulled to the positions that are more extreme from both sides of the extreme. So the people who are in the middle will have to choose, and they will have to polarize on two sides. So that's a very common attitude during the conflict, and also that's what leads to a fight. And at the core of the attitude polarization, the fact that you only interpret the evidence that you see fit. The final one I want to talk about is the primacy effect. It's kind of a very interesting, it's quite irrational, and it has a greater reliance of information encountered early. So this what I would call kind of latching on to first perception, the first perception becoming a belief. So immediately as you see somebody, say you want to hire somebody, or you hired somebody, and your first impression of the employee, say he didn't do a job well, immediately you could latch on to believe that's where he is not a good employee, yeah, and or he's not good at his task because he hasn't really done something. Now, there are other evidence as it kind of goes through serial position, more time accumulate, is not really affecting you as much. So when you start a lesson, for instance, the first primacy is really important. And that sort of circle here, when the primacy information received, it kind of gives you kind of a jolt and informs your belief system really early. Now, if during the time as it goes on, there are other contradictory information that happens, well, you tend to ignore it. Now, the most recent one, you'll have to confront it. You will recall it. Something in the middle, you won't even recall. Now, something just as recent, if you're asked, might be recalled. But now you have the primacy already formed in the beginning of your series, say, and if this particular fact or interpretation contradicts to what you have believed in earlier, you will fight it. You will at least not accept it as easily. What's in the middle will be lost forever. So what to do? You are biased. You have to go beyond your personal narrative. You have desire to be right, which is very fair. So you'll have to make sure what information do you remember? Do you remember all the information, only selectively? What evidence do you seek? And how do you interpret data? Now, do you interpret data selectively, or do you interpret data that is kind of at least try to attempt to do it? Try to attempt to interpret all of the data and not only the data that is selectively being acquired. Oh, maybe not the word acquired, but made. So there are some groups of people, and that scientists, the confirmation bias was studied. It's very well-known effect psychologically. In fact, the author of Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, Daniel Kahneman, described it quite well. There's a recent book from them when they also separate bias decisions and what they call noisy decision here, called noise. So please read that. It's Kahneman and two other people. And what I find interesting in these books, this particular also, it's called about flow in human judgment. As I was telling in my previous examples, I don't think it's a flaw in human judgment. First of all, I think you are very optimistic if you think you can correct it. What do you correct it to? And we're not judging machines. We're quite irrational. So I'm very skeptical about calling things biases, as I was telling you before. Now, it's a useful term. The example we just described, confirmation bias, is a huge one. because it affects us at so many levels. It's important to know. We're going to be able to kind of get rid of it completely. No. So I'm not really in a camp of this. I do study critical thinking and logic, but I think there are people that very susceptible to it. I would say maybe 90% of us. There are some people, for whatever reason, I think they may be this, sound maybe a little arrogant, but for whatever reason, they are less susceptible to, to conspirative thinking, to kind of these theories, and that was obviously during the vaccine period. So they're just maybe more trustful of authority at the same time as a little bit more, let's say, rational. Is probably, all of us are irrational, but they're maybe a little bit more. They look at the evidence. They, maybe could be reducing their biases a little bit. Most of us others do not. Now, it's like with the psychological condition. I don't think it's useful not to know, not to have a diagnosis. I think it's very useful to have it. It's very useful to understand, and then we'll all understand we're biased. And bias is really not really a great word. I mean, the cognitive, I'll call it the cognitive quirk, trait. Maybe the trait is a better word than bias, but I don't have any other words not accepted by others, so let's keep it that way. So hope we'll talk next time. So today was a confirmation bias, a great asset in propaganda. So sure, I mean, it's one of the great ones that we have, but there are many others. So we'll talk about availability bias, hindsight, and so on. Yeah. So see you next time, hopefully sooner. Bye.